We are here with John Herbst, director of the Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center for the Atlantic Council, who was a guest of the Center for American Study for our conference, Russian Political Influence in Europe, and we have a few questions he's going to answer.
In your opinion, what is the current relationship between Russia and the European Union?
I think the relationship at present is complex and somewhat difficult. The Kremlin does not like the fact that the European Union has sanctioned it for its aggression in Ukraine. The Kremlin doesn't like the fact that there are nations within the EU that are deeply skeptical of the Nord Stream 2 project. At the same time, there are nations in the EU that do not like the fact that Russia is trying to weaken the EU, that Russia is trying to establish policies with individual European nations rather than deal with the EU as a whole.
How has Russia's political presence in Southern Europe affected European cohesion, in your opinion?
Well, I think that Moscow has been very quick throughout Europe to seize upon differences among nations, to encourage nations to oppose the policies of the EU more broadly. And I think they've done that here in Southern Europe, perhaps with a bit more effectiveness than elsewhere. They've played upon the crisis spawned in North Africa and the Middle East, the refugee crisis, to try and create tensions between the southern nations and EU headquarters in Brussels, and to distract attention, especially in Southern Europe, from the Kremlin's aggression in Ukraine.
It has been said during the conference that the goal for Russia is to destabilize, to weaken Europe. What would you say is the ultimate goal? What is beyond destabilizing and weakening Europe?
Well, I think if the Kremlin had its way, there would be a dismembering of both NATO and the EU. I don't believe that goal is possible for them to achieve, but if they can see a weakening and less cohesion, maybe even one or two members dropping out the way Britain is leaving the EU, they'd see that as a plus for their policy.
And is Russia's perceived encirclement or Russia perceiving to be threatened by Europe just a perception of, or could we say that they may have a little reason, even if not as big as the reasons we may have to discuss Russian political influence in Europe?
It's sad to say, but the Kremlin in the past 10 years has invaded two countries, changed borders in two countries. That's demonstrated how they have committed aggression against their neighbors and posed a threat to those neighbors. NATO has expanded, the European Union has expanded, because the countries that joined NATO and the EU wanted to join NATO and the EU. Not because NATO attacked them, not because NATO conquered them, and not because the EU bribed them. These were the sovereign choices of individual nations. NATO and the EU pose no threat to Russia. In fact, the EU is very much to Russia's advantage. Having an economically strong entity on its western border gives Moscow a trade partner with which it can become more prosperous.
Mr. Anders Rasmussen, the former NATO General Secretary, was here a couple of weeks ago for our Transatlantic Forum on Russia, and he said that this NATO strategy against Russia should be peace through strength, which he identifies as a firm stance on sanctions, increased territorial defense, and he argues that we can only speak Putin's language because he understands only that language. Would you agree with that formula?
I would agree with everything that you quoted from Mr. Rasmussen. I would add, as part of our policy of pushing back against Kremlin aggression, we should be arming Ukraine with defensive lethal weapons.
And one last question. what are the most significant conclusions in the Atlantic Council's report?
Well, I think the significant findings there are that there are networks of influence in these three countries, in Greece, Spain, and Italy, which further a dangerous Russian policy. And what I would love to see as a result of our report are policies emerging in these three countries which recognize how dangerous Kremlin revisionism is, and it takes active steps to reduce these networks of Kremlin influence in their countries.
One last question. Do you believe that Putin ruling for 4 more years, 6 more years actually, following 2018's elections in Russia, would change the circumstances somehow?
Well, I think Putin is neither blind nor unintelligent. I think at some point, hopefully soon, but may take a little more, maybe longer than soon, he will recognize that his policies in Ukraine are failing, and he will withdraw his forces from Donbass, and so he can reach a peace in eastern Ukraine. And perhaps at the same time, he could recognize that better to have good relations with the European Union, with the United States, and with NATO.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.